And with this, I'm going to pass the baton to Hadar, who will introduce Allison, and then we'll start the webinar. Again, I see that more people are joining as we continue with this webinar. Hadar, floor is yours.
Excellent. Ori, thank you for your introduction and your mini filibuster there as we wait for everyone to join us. I am happy to be here and be here, Ori, with you and Allison, our guest, and all the rest of you who've joined us. So my guess is most of you are quite familiar with Allison. She is, of course, Tel Aviv-based and a journalist at Haaretz. She hosts their English language weekly podcast and co-hosts the Promised podcast, which is great. And of course, has been here in our neighborhood too. She's the former DC bureau chief for the Jerusalem Post, has written for many of American publications, The New Republic, Politico, The Forward, so many others. Allison is, one of the experts who has got her thumb on the constantly changing pulse. And Allison, I'm going to cut the intro short. We're less than a week away from election. This is election number 5. In the recent count. I know it's hard to keep track. So for those of you who feel like you've been on this webinar before, that may be why. But, I have questions. I know Ori does. I know folks who've joined us will. But before that, why don't you just start us off? Tell us what's going on. What's the feel there?
Well, it's funny that you chose the phrase constantly changing, because it kind of feels like Groundhog Day around here. Not only are we on our, but it's not only that we're on our 5th election, it's that the bottom line, when you look at the election polling data, is that the Israeli electorate is saying that, it wasn't fooling around the first 4 times when it voted, went to the polls, and had these inconclusive election results. If you look at the polls, we are headed for basically a very, very, very similar result to the same thing that we had last time, with maybe some slight adjustments around the edges. But the really big difference between this time and the previous times is that the previous times, this sitting prime minister was Benjamin Netanyahu. So if we are again stuck in a sticky wicket and are in extensive coalition negotiations and attempts at forming governments, and this thing drags on and drags on for months, it's going to drag on in a situation where the caretaker is Yair Lapid from the center-left bloc, and not Benjamin Netanyahu, who's Benjamin Netanyahu, and from the right bloc. So that is a big difference. So even if we do have similarly very frustrating results, the result of the result is going to be very different than in previous rounds. But go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, maybe before we start with the actual kind of substantive questions, to just give us a little bit of a picture of the atmosphere. What's the atmosphere like? I mean, is there any sense of excitement, interest, or are people just sick and tired of it all?
Well, Ori, you remember the old days when we used to actually have elections here every 4 years, and it was a really big event, really exciting. Everyone was into it. Everyone was focused on it. So, we've got some major voter fatigue happening here after all these rounds. So it is a very different atmosphere. I happen to notice that, I'm the mother of 20-somethings. And so I've sort of got a window into the younger generation. And there's a cynicism there. I mean, kind of reminds me a little bit of what I saw in the United States. Israelis are just always so engaged. The fate of the nation is up on every election, and they care so much, and they feel like their vote makes such a big difference and counts. And you see younger people, really asking themselves, it's crazy. They're 22 years old and they've already voted in how many elections? 3 or 4 elections. So, I think that's, some real damage that's been done, I think, in the Israeli psyche. It's been this time around, it's hard to compare all the different election cycles that came so fast and furious. This has been a weird campaign because it has been a very long one on one hand. On the other hand, it's covered the summer holidays and it's covered the Jewish holidays. So there was kind of a feeling, a very sleepy feeling of officially an election campaign is underway, but you don't really feel it. You didn't feel it over the summer. You certainly didn't feel it over the Jewish holidays. You know, a lot of people were busy with their celebrations and traveling abroad, etc. But I also think that after these 4 election experiences on the parts of the parties, from experience, they're understanding that the Israeli electorate only is waking up really a week or so before the elections. And so since, you know, we're going broke with these election campaign budgets, they're saving their money. So now all of a sudden we went from, you know, almost 0 campaign billboards to every billboard on the highway is plastered. And, you know, so the messages are now coming fast and furious, which is, you know, a little overwhelming and confusing for people. So it's been sort of this weird roller coaster where, you know, you're getting ready for the campaign to get started and you're going up and up and up and up and up. And now with about a week left until the elections, we're all just on this huge trajectory where we're, you know, heading into the polls. And the question is whether this momentum, this last minute momentum, is going to be able to drive voter turnout in an atmosphere where, as I said, a lot of people are apathetic and a lot of people feel like their vote doesn't count. You know, no matter what happens, we're going to be stuck and there's going to be no resolution to the election.
So thanks, Allison. You know, one of the things that we've certainly been talking about, and as you know, President Herzog is here right now. And I know there've been some conversations that I'm hoping to have one of them with him also. You know, the overall numbers, like you said, the polling are similar in terms of the left bloc and the right bloc, but the way those break down are not necessarily the same. And, you know, that big question is about Ben Gvir and you know, and his party, but really him as the embodiment of that, and how many seats they might get. And of course, Netanyahu has, you know, said he'd love to have him as a partner, he'd like him to be a minister, all of these things. It's definitely something that we're seeing folks in the American Jewish community and in the American political space start to take notice of. Can you talk to us a little bit about, you know, what it feels like there in terms of his role in this election?
Well, I've got a little bit of deja vu when I look at Ben Gvir and his image and what the media is doing to him. I include myself in that. It's a little bit of deja vu in remembering the Donald Trump phenomenon, because, you know, he says and does terrible things. It's a terrible party. The idea, you know, seeing how high his religious Zionism party is polling now, you know, within the right bloc, he's just taking big bites out of the Likud, and you know, so it looks like if there would be a right-wing coalition government, it would be an extremely powerful party. There's even talk, they're flexing their muscles. They're talking about maybe even taking the defense ministry of religious Zionism. That's been the buzz there. So on the one hand, as a journalist, you feel like, you know, you have to warn, you have to ring the bells, you have to say, look at this guy, it's going to be so terrible. But on the other hand, you know, similar to the Trump phenomenon, the more you give him the attention as being, ooh, the bad guy and the guy that the media hates, and the, you know, so there is this sort of counter pressure of the voter who kind of wants to stick it to the man and says like, ooh, that, you know, this guy's really pissing off everybody and is bitter for whatever reason, wants to piss people off. So it's, you know, it's a similar dynamic, and it's a very scary one with potential scary consequences, you know, I guess as we also know from the example of Donald Trump. And so that, you know, the big dilemma as a member of the press is, do you sound the warning bells, or do you stop giving this guy so much oxygen, or, you know, what do you do about it, you know, especially when he is growing in popularity?
Ori, sorry, before we keep going, I want to just ask a quick follow-up on that.
Right.
So, I mean, again, I've seen those polling numbers. He appears to be growing in popularity. We know what
within his bloc, within the right-wing bloc.
Yeah, we know what Bibi has said. Is, you know, is there much conversation about, I guess, whether he should be in the government, whether he should be a minister? You know, what are other voices saying about that, or is that just considered sort of a fait accompli that he's going to be in, assuming the right, you know, if a right bloc wins?
No, absolutely a fait accompli, and for, you know, for a very specific reason. Netanyahu doesn't only want to get to 61 votes. He doesn't only want to get power. he wants certain kinds of partners in his government. He wants partners in his coalition who are going to help lift certain parts of his anatomy out of the fire with his corruption trial. So he knows that in Smotrich, Ben-Gvir as loyal coalition partners, just like the ultra-Orthodox, that they're not only going to join with him, they're going to support him. And it was, Smotrich came out just last week and proposed this, large reform of the entire legal system, which just so happened to include getting rid of the some of the charges that Netanyahu is facing. So it's there's no secret there. They're saying the quiet part out loud, and so therefore they are highly desirable coalition partners for Netanyahu, who one of his top priorities in winning this election is to save his own skin. So unfortunately, I would love it if I could say that many people across the political spectrum, including on the right, are declaring what a moral disaster and an international relations disaster it would be if Ben-Gvir reaches a position of power. But unfortunately, the dynamics are such that people can't even imagine him winning the amount of seats that he's predicted to win in the polls, Netanyahu winning the election and bringing him into the coalition and doing anything but giving him a lot of power. The only hesitancy that we see on Netanyahu's part is that at campaign events, he's trying to avoid being photographed with him. And that's really making Ben-Gvir angry. Ben-Gvir is really complaining about that he's not getting any respect, that Netanyahu is avoiding him.
I'm sure that we'll come back with Ben-Gvir later. I'm sure that there will be some questions from our viewers. And again, I'm segueing just to remind people that you are invited to ask questions. Use the Q&A tool that is at the bottom of your screen, and you can do that at any time. Allison, I wanted to ask you to help us understand better why the issue of turnout this time around is so crucial. You mentioned it earlier, and I thought maybe you could elaborate. And I guess I'll kind of split the question into two. One is the overall turnout, and then the question of Arab voters turnout. So just to give a little bit of background, in this election round, the turnout is expected to be lower. In the four that preceded this one, the turnout rate ranged between 67% and 71%, which is pretty high when you compare it to other countries in the world, with a rate among Arab voters being significantly lower, somewhere between 44 and 63% during those four election campaigns. Given the overall voting fatigue, what kind of turnout rate would you expect? And why is it so crucial? And again, let's divide it to the overall turnout and then the question of Arab voters.
Well, the overall turnout is a very important question, because basically what robbed Netanyahu of his victory the last time around in the last election was a hesitancy for people who traditionally voted for him to actually turn out and go to the polls. Not a feeling of urgency, of the need to have Netanyahu there. So that's a big question, whether that is going to happen again, or whether somehow he's going to be able to revive that feeling or revive that sense of urgency. It may be now that he's in the opposition, maybe he can he's going to motivate his voters so much to bring him back, because he's not there anymore, in a way that there was a complacency, like, oh yeah, he's prime minister, he'll stay prime minister, he'll win. So that's a big question. The Jewish left and center left seems highly motivated to turn out and vote. I think that there's a high satisfaction level with Yair Lapid and the desire to keep him there, and we see that with the polling data within the center and center left bloc. There's definitely a trend towards Lapid and towards Yesh Atid. His poll numbers are going up within the bloc, but that is a two-sided coin, because where is that support coming from? That support is coming from some people who traditionally vote for the Labour Party or for the Meretz Party, and those two parties are teetering on the electoral threshold. So what could be, you know, a sweeping personal victory for Lapid of, you know, lifting him from, you know, he's polling at 27 seats now to, you know, 28 or 29 seats, that could end in disaster if he pulls too many of those votes from, let's say, Meretz voters and throws the Meretz party below the electoral threshold and sabotages his own electoral block. So it's a tightrope walk. It's a tightrope walk there. Want me to go ahead to the Arab turnout issue?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks.
So this time around, it was just a last minute shocker in that the joint list, which was almost all of the Arab parties, you know, joined together in this one list, a very powerful block of 12 to 15 seats with a lot of influence in the Knesset. Last minute squabbling made it fall apart into its, you know, its divided parts. Two of the parties are together, Hadash Tal, but one of them, Balad, is below the electoral threshold. The Ram party is, you know, teetering at 4. So traditionally, when we haven't had this joint list, when we haven't had sort of this powerful feeling of unity and one big party to support, the Arab turnout has suffered. And so there's a great prediction and a great fear, you know, in the Arab sector that the splintering, that the dividing of the Arab representation into these small units is going to hurt turnout, and that could really affect the election results, and be a great thing for the right. And you kind of see it in the tenor of the campaign. You know, Likud, Netanyahu in each campaign has had different levels of anti-Arab rhetoric, you know, racist, you know, fanning of the flames. And you can tell that he's being very careful this time not to give the Arabs any reason to want to turn out in big numbers to vote against him. So he is being less inflammatory. On the other hand, you know what? He can afford to be less inflammatory because now he's got Ben-Gvir to his right. So you know, he comes off. If the previous elections were Raklo Bibi, anything but Bibi, so the rhetoric this time is Raklo Ben-Gvir, you know, anybody but Ben-Gvir. So he's able to be a little bit more like the good cop this time around, Netanyahu, because he's got the quote unquote bad cop to his right, who's being more inflammatory in those terms. So it's, you know, interesting to see that what that dynamic is like. And I don't see the Arab voters being able to motivate themselves to come out and vote against Ben-Gvir the way that they were motivated to come out and vote against Netanyahu coming into power.
I mean, it's interesting, you know, Netanyahu, if we look back at when he was prime minister, the previous governments he headed, he's of course most comfortable when he's got people to his right in that government. Mm-hmm. We see that here in the US as time after time he's come here and said, well, I'd like to do this, or I wish we didn't have to do that, but you know, my government, yeah. What can I do? Mm-hmm. One question I want to ask, and then we'll open up to some of the folks posting the Q&A also. You know, you talked briefly about the threshold, and you know, if Yair Lapid draws too many votes from Avodah, from Labor, or from Meretz, also among the different Arab parties, can you just tell everyone, you know, I know there's sort of a timeline where there's options for parties to run together, which has passed. Then there's options for parties to make, you know, vote sharing agreements. So where are we? What are the possibilities for how that could play out now? Those different parties hitting the thresholds or not?
Well, obviously, as I said, if the Meretz or the Labor Party falls below the threshold, they're in trouble. There are several parties that are drawing, you know, significant amounts of votes that are clearly below the threshold, and so there's a lot of pressure on them to drop out already, so that their votes will be kicked into their corresponding blocks. The main recipient of that kind of pressure at the moment is Ayelet Shaked, who, you know, as we know, is a very strong right-wing ideologue, but was in partnership with Naftali Bennett part of this change coalition. She has consistently said to people, you know, she's still rallying the troops, don't lose hope, you know, we can still make it. There's no way she's getting above that threshold. And if her, you know, 1.7% of the vote is wasted, that's a real blow, I think to the right.
And are we past the timeline where any of those parties can still make vote sharing agreements or do any of those things?
No, the vote sharing agreements are already in place. That's locked in. The main thing that a party can do now is announce that they're dropping out of the election. So they'll still officially be on the ballot, but if they make it public that they're not running or that they quit, then presumably nobody will vote for them, or a smaller amount of people will vote for them. But we do have some of these tiny parties. We've got the Burning Youth Party, which is the rebellious youth party. We've got some economic reform parties running, and so the parties are pressuring and waiting to see if they'll stick with it to the end or if they'll quit.
Good. So we do have one interesting question here from our audience. And again, if people want to ask questions, use the Q&A tool on the bottom of your screen. That one has to do with the joint list. And the question is, why is it that the joint list fell apart? What happened?
Last minute squabbling and negotiations, I think, over who was going to sit, in what order that they were going to sit. And I think some substantive policy issues. I mean, they are a very diverse group. You've got from completely declared socialist, communist leanings and a joint Arab Jewish list to the Ram party, the Islamists. So it was, imagine if you were trying to push all of the Israeli Jewish parties together into one party. So it was kind of actually miraculous that they were able to stay together for the number of the elections that they were. It's not such a shock that they were seen that they fell apart at the last minute. It's a shame and it's too bad, and it's not in their self-interest because they hold a lot more power when they stick together. But because they have such divergent views on so many issues, and because there's so much squabbling over who's going to get in one seat, it's not a big surprise that they weren't able to hold their coalition together.
When they were still together, I have to just add here, because I've been following this for a long time.
You're the expert in this more than I am.
They served as such an inspiration for so many people around the Arab world, particularly on the Palestinian arena, but not only. Mm-hmm. The fact that national unity, which is a very important political value in Palestinian society, was able to bring together people who are on opposing sides of the political spectrum. It's interesting because that's one of the reasons why this militia in Nablus now, the Lion's Den, is so popular. Mm-hmm. And that is because, again, it brings together factions from the extreme right to the extreme left on the Palestinian in the Palestinian arena.
But the real split, as you know, Ori, inside the Arab parties is not the one from this past election, but the one from the previous, and that's the split of Mansour Abbas's Ram party with the rest of the joint list, because that is this clear ideological decision that we cannot hold the welfare of the Arab population within the Green Line hostage to resolution of the Israel-Palestinian conflict, and an attitude of trying to compartmentalize, advocating for what's best for Israeli Arab citizens from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and saying we may not agree with these parties ideologically on the West Bank, on the fate of the Palestinians, but that doesn't mean that we won't cooperate with them in terms of getting budgets for municipalities, getting education, fighting crime in the Arab sector, and taking all these steps. So that's really the fundamental split within the Israeli Arab political scene, is holding out on ideological grounds for the Palestinian cause, or compromising on their stand on the Palestinian cause in order to further the practical welfare of the Palestinian citizens of Israel.
Well, and Allison, thank you. I think the way we saw that play out, what that meant is being part of the government or not, right? In order to do the things you were talking about, prioritizing the budgets and the services of Palestinian citizens. Yeah. So that's
the Ram party was just as willing, and I believe remains just as willing, to join a government with Benjamin Netanyahu at the head towards that end.
So they have that's a great segue into my next question, which is, as similar as this may be to previous elections, none of us have a crystal ball, so we know that. But can you sort of lay out for people what would it look like? What results lead to a continuation of a Lapid-led government, or what results lead to presumably a Netanyahu government? Like in terms of what would have to happen for those things to come to play?
Well, it's a clearer path, and one sense is a more likely path towards a Netanyahu government, because he's been polling, in his bloc at 59-ish to 60 seats. Some polls scraping 61, and if he could then convince Abbas to go in with him and convince his far-right coalition partners Smotrich and Ben-Gvir to accept Abbas in that government, I think that's what a right-wing government would look like, with or without Abbas. Without Abbas, if they hit the 61, it's going to be a very, very fragile majority and a fragile government. He'll have officially made it, but as we saw in our last government, it's not so good. All you need is one renegade member and you're out. So that could be a very, very fragile situation. Lapid, it's a harder road. He's declared that he will not consider bringing Hadash-Tal into the government. And Hadash-Tal doesn't look very excited about the idea of joining a Zionist government either. So it's a lot harder to see how Lapid will have a road into it. It's funny, not a crystal ball, we can't see the future. In the previous government, the Bennett-Lapid government, no one could have imagined that coalition coming together. That was sort of unpredictable and unforeseeable. So I'm kind of reluctant to sit here and say like, oh, that will definitely happen and that will never happen because of what happened the last time. There are other, possible configurations people talk about, that if maybe people were willing to, if Lapid was willing to step aside and let Gantz, let's say, lead a centrist left coalition, that the ultra-Orthodox would agree to join, because it wouldn't be Lapid at the head, it would be Gantz at the head. There are some people who are saying that no matter how many times Gantz vows that Gantz is the leader of this National Unity Party that he joined with the Gideon Saar's party, which, that no matter how many times they say they'll never go with Netanyahu, they'll never sit in a government with Netanyahu, there is still that possibility. Who knows what carrot
Netanyahu because they've done that before?
What?
I said, you mean because they've done that before?
Only once, right? Only some people say, oh, he'll never fall for that again. And then others say that, anything's possible, and that could happen. Yeah. So
I haven't seen the Benny Gantz Charlie Brown cartoon. It's easy to imagine.
Exactly. Yeah. Pulling that football away. But who knows? Again, the last time around, why did Gantz do it? He did it because of the COVID crisis. Remember? He said, we're in an emergency. This is a crisis. This is no time for partisan, nitpicking, and I'm going to do it. I'm going to join Netanyahu. So God forbid, I'm like knocking on all the wood here, that we would have something equivalent to that. You also, you can't predict. This is a crazy part of the world, wars, plagues, etc. So if there, something, could happen, between now and the election or after the election, that could possibly, make people cry unity and rally the troops, and we have to stick together. Anything's possible.
Stranger things have happened, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Ori?
Happy to see that we have quite a few questions in Q&A, and I'm going to do what I usually do and kind of string together or cobble together a few questions around the same theme. So in the past, when Netanyahu, assuming that Netanyahu, is capable of being the first one to try to form a coalition, in the past, when he was in that position, he clearly prioritized the parties from the center, tried to create a coalition with parties from the center rather than the extreme right. You explained earlier one of the considerations why he may choose to actually go with the extreme right this time, which is that they would be more likely to support some kind of radical changes in the judicial system. But there's another issue that I thought would be interesting to talk a little bit about, and that is the mainstreaming, normalizing of what used to be taboo in Israeli society, which is Kahanist ideology. Why is that
illegal
happening?
taboo.
Illegal, yes, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Yitzhak Shamir used to walk out of the Knesset when Rabbi Kahana came in. It was, even among the right, these views were considered, they were considered persona non grata. Now, you have to acknowledge that Ben Gvir has attempted to give the appearance of softening the edges of his views, that he took down the picture, right? The famous picture in his living room of Dr. Baruch Goldstein, who murdered, and that, whatever, that he's a more sober and serious version of himself. Unfortunately, it has been normalized, and you see some of those the views that are held inside the Ben Gvir Smotrich bloc. There are elements of the Likud party that aren't so far away from that ideologically. So the lines have been blurred. In terms of the actual policies. Ben Gvir carries a historical stigma, because of his association with Kahanaism and some of the criminal activities that he was involved with in the past. But if you just look straight at policy and policy views, it's not that much further right than we see in what we call the center right.
Which just shows you how far that's moved since the great leftist Yitzhak Shamir was in office.
Yeah.
I'm going to keep going on Ben Gvir for one more round here, and then we can talk about some other people, hopefully. One of the things
you see, just like Trump, we're talking about him all the time.
One of the things that Netanyahu at least used to talk about domestically, right, was that Rak Bibi Yachol, right? Only Bibi can, has the public international presence. He's the one who can stand up to American presidents and do this, and Europe and blah, blah, blah. So he, at least in the past, has cared about the international relations piece and profile. Here we've already seen Senator Bob Menendez, who's considered one of, Israel's great champions in the Senate, and others as well follow up, saying that they would be concerned if Ben Gvir was in the government. So it's not just, the far left in American politics saying that. Does anybody there care, about specifically the U.S. voice, I would say, in terms of U.S. Although we've also seen, others internationally echoing that. And, and is anybody talking about that piece, either on the right or the left, about what it would mean if Ben Gvir was in the government, what it would mean internationally?
Well, certainly on the left, but the people who are going to vote for Ben Gvir aren't persuaded by any of that, and they don't care about they don't care about any of that. Certainly, the people who are going to vote against him are concerned. Part of the reason that they're going to vote against him. But I'll return to Ben Gvir, but just to go to your other point about how Bibi as the great statesman, and only he can do it, and only he can, meet with the presidents, and he's head and shoulders above the rest. He's in a different league. That line has been really undermined over the past year, when we've seen first Bennett, but most especially Lapid, comport himself very effectively, in front of American presidents, in front of and especially, since he came from being foreign minister, his speech at the UN, et cetera. So Bibi's kind of lost that ground, and saying like, oh yeah, I'm the one who can maneuver internationally, and Lapid can't. And his real attempt to undermine Lapid with this Lebanon border agreement, the sea agreement, has really been fallen flat. It hasn't really gained any steam. The sense that, oh, Lapid sold us out and he's surrendering, et cetera, et cetera. He sold out to Nasrallah. None of those messages seem to have been taken and seem to echo. But to return to what you're saying, are Israelis worried that a government with Ben Gvir in it, will hurt the relationship with the United States? I mean, like I said, in certain more left-wing sectors, yes, but honestly, I think that they're more concerned about what it's going to do domestically. And we're not just talking about domestically in terms of Arab relations. If you look at the domestic agenda of this religious Zionist party's in terms of women. For the first time, you've got in the campaign, I actually have a fresh article up on this in the Haaretz.com to plug my own writing. That for the first time, there are calls in some of the center parties from Yesh Atid and from this National Unity Party with women saying, look at what this religious Zionist party wants to do. They want to roll back reforms that our health minister, Haaretz, took on abortion. They want to make it more difficult for women to get abortions. They're going to make it, more difficult for women to serve in a greater range of positions in the army. They're going to want greater gender segregation, et cetera. So as much as everyone cares about how it looks from the United States, I think people are equally, if not more, concerned about what having this party as a powerful party is going to do inside the government. I mean, look at Smotrich's new proposal for the sweeping reforms of the legal system. People say, oh, it's the end of democracy. Maybe that's a little bit of hyperbole, but it is very, very alarming. So yes, it's disturbing in what it does to the relationship with the United States. But I think, all politics being local, people are more concerned even with what it's going to mean domestically.
I'm just going to say quickly before I turn it back to Ori, what I think everyone here in the US listening to you is thinking of, wow, that sounds so familiar.
Yeah. So. No coincidence. There is a connection. You've got a lot of the new socially conservative trends in this religious Zionist party, to a certain extent in other parties, isn't spontaneously popping out of the woodwork. There are very well-funded efforts funded from the United States by organizations like the Kohelet Forum, et cetera, trying to implant US-style social conservatism into religious right-wing parties in Israel, who once upon a time were more like live and let live, that we're going to do our thing and you're going to do your thing, and are being, I think, influenced by trends in the United States and by money coming from the United States to try to bring that kind of overall social conservatism to Israel.
And campaign consultants coming from the United States as well.
No, yeah, and absolutely. And, the same kind of messaging on LGBT and trans, et cetera, that's, really chilling, for women, for LGBT people, et cetera. So I just wanted to point out that it's no coincidence.
Allison, you talked about plugging your writing in Haaretz, so people in the chat could find a link to your page on Haaretz's website with all of your articles there. And the question I want to ask you is something that I'm asked a lot, and I'm wondering what your take is on it, as someone who's to some extent looking at the Israeli system from outside. And that is, given the election fatigue and given the dysfunctionality as we've seen now in election round after round, why aren't Israelis insisting more on changing the system? And would that help if you change the system?
Well, there was an attempt, or you remember once upon a time we tried direct election of the prime minister, and that didn't last very long and didn't take very well. Yeah. I mean, my cynical answer is that the people with the actual power to change the system are the ones who are benefiting from the current system. So it's very hard to get them to change the system. I'm sure that's also has its reflection in what's going on in the United States as well, right?
Yeah, I think that there's also maybe a less cynical explanation, and that is that Israeli society is so diverse and comprised of so many pressure groups with so many different interests, that it really does make sense to have a multitude of parties with a relatively low threshold.
Yeah. I guess so. It is reflective, but it certainly is not very functional, and not very good for the country. So
remember back, in the 80s and 90s, we used to make fun of Italy for having elections,
so frequently,
every third month. And yeah, take that back. Sorry, Italy. I want to switch us a little bit from sort of the meat of the politics we've been talking about to the policy a little bit. If we roll back the clock and remember, when Netanyahu was prime minister, annexation was a very popular word.
Right.
And, he said he was doing it. He was going ahead. He had a coalition that seemed behind that. Then we got all kinds of different people in protests, and we ended up with Abraham Accords and a sort of quiet, once you do it. So is that, A, do you think that's on his political agenda? If, you know, if we get a Bibi, Smotrich, Ben Gvir, et cetera, government, should we be getting ready for them to roll out and say, here comes annexation? And B, because I can't really go away from the politics part, you know, is anybody talking about that in the campaign one way or the other?
Nobody's really talking about it in the campaign. I mean, really, the conflict in general is so not discussed. You know, other than in terms of whatever security things, you know, who's being tougher on fighting terrorism, et cetera. But like the actual fate of the territories is not discussed, even, you know, and probably especially on the left, because they, you know, they feel that if they're going to be able to appeal to voters, it's going to be through, you know, more domestic and social issues, and you know, being left wing on this isn't a popular draw anymore. And you know, look at where it's gone. I mean, that it was controversial for Lapid to stand up at the UN and call for a two-state solution. You know, that's where, you know, that's considered the far left. But I don't see any kind of like return to the annexation, attempt at annexation. I mean, mainly because, you know, for better or for worse, I think mostly for better, annexation was horse traded for the Abraham Accords. That's how we got the Abraham Accords. You know, one of the few things we can thank Jared Kushner for maybe was getting us Abraham Accords instead of annexation. So I think that Netanyahu would be hesitant to, because the Abraham Accords is such an achievement, to risk that by moving towards annexation, and then, you know, maybe having these Gulf states threaten to cut off ties, you know, if you did move towards annexation. And you know, we've had this period with this the coalition of change, which was so diverse ideologically. It was basically, you know, in a frozen status quo situation. So, you know, I think we could we'll definitely see a surge in settlement building. You know, I don't think we won't see an effect if we have a far right government in terms of actual activity when it comes to, you know, usurping more and more of the West Bank and entrenching the occupation. Specifically annexation, you know, I would say, you know, maybe around the edges and, you know, tweaking a regulation here and there, but I don't think any kind of like large grandstanding move that, again, could result in some sort of big diplomatic consequences for Netanyahu, because I don't think he would want that.
It's interesting because, you know, people who had a range of responses and feelings about the Abraham Accords and whether they were, you know, the greatest achievement ever and, you know, peace in the Middle East versus, you know, some nice, you know, economic deals and et cetera. But one thing that I think some of the more skeptical people, I would say, and well, everybody, including them, hoped for was that as you move forward with the Abraham Accords and Israel actually builds economic relationships with these other countries more deeply, that actually could then be a deterrent to keeping a government from doing something like annexation. So,
and I think that to me that rings true even with the Netanyahu in power.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm reading a question here from the Q&A, which says, where are the religious parties going this time? And I guess the answer is with Netanyahu. They've sworn allegiance to him. But maybe we'll broaden the scope a little bit, and I'll ask you, Allison, do you see anything new, anything interesting this time around with the ultra-Orthodox parties, Shas and UTJ?
Well, yeah, and that their younger members, some of them are really entranced by Ben Gvir. You know, especially the ultra-Orthodox that live over the Green Line, and they're fighting to keep their flock in place and not stray, you know, into the ideological right-wing parties that Ben Gvir's got an attraction. It's a different part of the religious voter, a smaller part of, you know, the more moderate religious voter. Is pretty homeless this time around. I've spoken to a lot of people who previously voted for Bennett, in the last election, who, you know, a lot of them are really figuring out who to vote for, because if you're in Israel, you're Orthodox, you're religious, you're center right, you don't love Netanyahu, who do you vote for this time? You're not going to vote for Smotrich, Ben-Gvir. And so some of the parties, like especially Benny Gantz, he recruited Matan Kahana from Bennett's party into his party to try to maybe attract some of that vote over there. But I spoke to, in my last article, I spoke to English-speaking immigrants who were supporting Lapid. And some of them were actually moderate, relatively, liberal in the, I mean, some of them were former Netanyahu voters, but who had voted for Bennett the last time around and were actually voting for Lapid this time.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So I've got another Bibi question here. Many of the previous, elections from these last few years, right, have been, anybody but Bibi, anything but Bibi. That's been what the election has been framed about, right? It certainly wasn't the occupation. It certainly wasn't any other, social issue. It was like, who's in charge? Is it Bibi? Is it somebody else? And I think there were a lot of people who felt like even Bennett, who, certainly people in our camp didn't love, like anything was better than Bibi, because you could demonstrate to Israel and to the Israeli electorate, of which a whole generation has grown up basically only with Bibi, that, there are other options, that it doesn't have to be him.
Yep. It was a huge psychological shift to see someone else in that prime minister's office. It was a major, major change, although, look at the polls, it doesn't seem to have moved the needle a lot in terms of voters.
Well, so the question, and now I am asking you to look in the crystal ball. Let's say, Lapid, Gantz, whatever, some non-Bibi bloc gets 61, and somebody whose name is not Benjamin Netanyahu is the next prime minister.
Okay. That's a very optimistic crystal ball you've got there.
I'm just, it could be, right? It could. Does that do it? Does that move the country past Bibi? Do you think we see other leaders step up? Because certainly Smotrich and Ben-Gvir is building support, but he's not building support right now to challenge Bibi, right? Bibi is the face and the voice on the right. Is there a possibility that if the left puts together a government here, that the right moves on from Bibi?
Well, that's what we said last time when we had this coalition government. Like, people were like, "Oh, when's Bibi going to drop out of political life? When is he going to be gone?" And there's two factors which mean that Bibi is not going to be gone. Number one is his trial. He has zero motivation to step out of the ring, knowing that really the only way to save himself from what looks like a likely conviction and down the line after 1 million appeals jail sentence is going to be calling it a political witch hunt, staying in the political game so that he can do that. But more importantly, democracy-wise, the Likud is indisputably the largest political party in this country. And they have, make your Trump analogy, they have indisputably said, this is the guy we want. This is the guy we like. This is the guy we want to elect and we want to head our party. Same could happen with the Republicans and Trump, right? So I don't see, like you said, the scenario that you pointed out, we've kind of already had until the Likud lets go of Netanyahu, which doesn't, I don't see being in the cards of any of our crystal balls. So unless the two things, unless he's no longer in legal trouble and unless the Likud stops being loyal to him, I don't see us seeing the back end of Netanyahu anytime in the near future.
And before we maybe move on from the Bibi conversation, we mentioned the trial. Can you just tell folks quickly, like, where is that, process-wise?
Testimony. They're testifying against him. All of the stuff that's most of it has been already leaked to the media. The systematic giving of the gift. I mean, we're still on the first case, right? We're still on the cigars and champagne case. We're still on the people testifying about Arnon Milchan giving him these treats all the time. So, we're still at I want to say we're in the middle of the trial, but we're really at the beginning. We're in the midst of the trial, but we're still at the beginning of the trial. So it sort of soldiers on as if, it's in a parallel universe to the political reality somehow. And I feel like we Israelis had become a little bit like the frog in the boiling water, because we were like, oh no, we're going to have a, prime minister or somebody, trying to be prime minister who is under investigation. Oh no, he's been indicted. Oh no, he's on trial, etc. And it's been going on for so long. We're like, oh yeah, he's on trial for some bribery, for some corruption. And I don't want to say we've become like the Italians, but and I don't want to say it feels normal, but it does. It feels usual. I don't know if that means it's normal.
So if you polled 2 million Israeli voters, how many of them would care about the trial? Care about it where it impacts their vote?
It impacts their vote, and I think it has impacted their vote. Otherwise, Netanyahu would still be in power. I think that there is a, kishka, there's a gut sense that for left or for right, people like Bennett and Lapid, politicians they may be, are still in it for the good of the country. That is their absolute top priority, is the country's good. And I feel that Netanyahu has lost support from people I know personally who, really will say really good things about things that he did in the past. They feel like he has, crossed a line, turned a curve in which his priority is Benjamin Netanyahu. Again, the Trump analogy, right? That beyond ideology and beyond policy and beyond that straight politics, the feeling that what this guy cares about is his own political survival, is his own legal survival, that he does not have the best interests of the country at heart. Therefore, we cannot trust him. Therefore, I do not support him. I think, is the crux of the Bibi problem. And I think if that gut sense wasn't there, he's still popular, and that he would be the one in power. So I think that's the big factor.
I want to make sure that we don't end this webinar without letting people know that next Friday, the Friday right after the elections, this is going to be November 4th, we'll have a post-election webinar with Dalia Shaindlin. There is a very good article that Dalia published today in Haaretz, and I just put the link to it in the chat. I want to end as kind of a final note in terms of the questions here, with a question that I'm going to actually pose to both of you, Hadar and Allison, and that is something that came in the Q&A, and I think is a good and interesting thing to sort of ponder. Which is, to what degree American Jews can really impact, can do things maybe generally in relation to Israeli politics. So maybe we'll make a few insights about this issue and then bring it to an end.
On what American Jews can do?
Yeah.
I mean, I think in terms of engaging and raising their voices, and I think the making it clear what the impact of a far right, coalition government that relies so heavily, and it will rely heavily on the support of a party like the religious Zionist party will do. I don't think the Menendez remarks, because they weren't made in front of a microphone, right? They were made behind closed doors, made enough of an impact on the Israeli public. I think there's been, we've seen a resounding silence from some of the most powerful and mainstream American Jewish organizations on this issue. They're not speaking out. And I've heard it argued that in the past, when they did speak out in 2019, for example, it influenced Netanyahu's decisions as to how prominent a role to give them and how much power to give them. So it would be nice if some of the organizations with leaders, behind closed doors, saying this is going to be really a disaster in terms of maintaining, bipartisan support in Congress that is going to, guarantee continued aid to Israel. I think that speaking out is the most important thing they can do. And the Israeli left is really embattled, so a little moral support would be good. I know that's what you guys do full time, but making them feel like there are people on their side who see their work and see their efforts and understand what they're due, in their Sisyphusian battle, is always helpful.
Yeah, I think that there are, you're talking about organizational voices, and of course, APN has spoken up very clearly about Ben-Gvir and what we think of him and his possible inclusion in the government, as have many of our colleagues, by the way. Rabbi Rick Jacobs from the URJ was very, very strong, and of course, colleagues at J Street and other places as well. But there's no doubt there's a whole range of organizations, Allison being more polite than I am, didn't list them, but ADL and AJC and APAC and others who, as recently as 2019 did speak out and did talk about, the dangers, who, this time around declined to comment when reached by Haaretz reporters, amongst others. And I think that those voices are important for organizations to speak up, but not only to say it. I think there's one level of, saying it publicly, saying it in the press, so people in Israel hear it, so Netanyahu hears it. I actually think it's really important for our political leaders here to hear it. And I can tell you that, we've been talking to folks in the administration and folks certainly in Congress about, what are they going to do and what are they going to say? And I think that's important because they're following this, but they look to us, and I say us, APN, but also the American Jewish community, for thoughts and for leadership on these things. And so being clear that yes, for most American Jews, they're not Israeli citizens, they're not going to vote, they don't often want to be seen in the role of telling Israelis what to do, but we can and should, and I think have a moral responsibility to talk about what it means to us and what it would mean if somebody like Ben-Gvir and his party were part of the government, whether he was defense minister or any other minister in the government. All of those conversations, all of those talking points about shared US-Israel values, unfortunately, they may be true in ways that was not what we intended and what we hoped for when that was said. But just like we speak out on those issues here in the US, I think that combination is important. I will also add, just because there was a question somebody threw in there, there are, by the way, and it's, we're only a few days away from the election, but totally legal ways for those who want to financially support what we would call independent expenditure campaigns, basically people who are doing nonpartisan get out the vote activities, people who are doing issue campaigns in Israel to bring attention to things that people can, and many in America on both the right and the left do support things like that. So there are ways to be involved for people who want to do that directly on the ground there. But I think the most crucial and most direct for us is to really, as we do, speak our voice to our leaders here and speak up, and for us to model to others in the American Jewish community the willingness to do that, and to not just sit back and be cowed and say, well, we can't say that because somebody might not like it.
Allison, we have time for one quick last question. We've seen lots of Israeli journalists crossing the lines into politics. Are you considering a run in the next round?
Great question, Ori. I think you know the answer. There's no way. Being an Israeli politician is something that I wouldn't wish on anyone. And I think the trend of journalists moving into politics in Israel is more of a comment on the salary level of journalism than it is on the attractiveness of a political life.
At least it's not all just generals.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, you keep up your good work with print and with Haaretz's podcast, which is actually really excellent.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I want to thank you very, very much for joining us, Allison.
Thanks for having me.
I want to thank everyone else who joined us on this webinar. As we told you earlier and when we just started, video is going to be posted on our YouTube channel, audio on Peacecast, our podcast. And with that, thank you very much for joining, and goodbye.